I was reminded this morning, I've never done church at 8:30 in the morning, right? So that caused a lot of challenges for me. But one of the challenges that we had was the roadworks coming here. And it just reminded me that there are all sorts of different things in our world that seek to kind of disrupt and cause us worry and concern. I wasn't sure if we would get from Kingscliff to here on time, because every time I've driven on that road, there was just so much traffic, and it was a disaster. Because you see, the reality is, we live in a peril-some world, don't we? We live in a world where there are all sorts of things that disrupt us, all sorts of things that cause us worry and concern. One of the first worries that I had when I moved to the beautiful shores of Australia, we had just moved into a new apartment in Cronulla, Sydney, back in 2006. And we'd been moving all day. We were getting pretty hangry, my wife and I, just the two of us at the time. So she decided to pick up the phone and call to order a pizza. And me being the hunter-gatherer that I was, I'm like, I'll go get the pizza rather than getting it delivered. The only problem was, I had no idea where the shop was. I thought I knew where it was, and I found myself driving around for about a good 15 minutes, and I couldn't find the shop anywhere. My hopes and dreams of romantic pizza on the balcony looking over the water was just drifting away, and I was getting more and more hungry as well at the same time. So I thought that I would pick up the phone, call the shop, and ask them to give me directions. This was back in 2006, right before there was GPS in every car and we didn't have smartphones. The only problem was when I picked up the phone, I didn't get a real person. I got a voice recognition bot, and if you've heard anybody from Northern Ireland, voice recognition, they don't really go together all that well. And what I heard on the other end of the phone was, "Welcome to Domino's Pizza. Please state which store you would like." Now, the pizza shop was in a nearby suburb called Caringbah. I think somebody put it up on the screen before, just for translation purposes, but Caringbah. And what I got in response was, "We are sorry, we do not recognize that response. Please try again." And so I tried Caringbah, and I tried all sorts of different variations, and I kept on getting, "We are sorry, we do not recognize that response. Please hang up and try again later." So I mustered up my best Aussie accent, picked up the phone again, and I just went, "Caringbah, mate. Caringbah." I tried every variation, and every time I kept on coming up stumps. By this stage, I was probably about 40 minutes late for my pizza, and then I saw this bloke walking out of the pub, stumbling out of the pub, walking along the street, and I pulled up alongside him pretty fast. I think he even mounted the curb. I had no idea what he was thinking at that point. And I walked up to him and I said, "Mate, I know this is a really strange request, but can you just say Caringbah into my phone, please?" And he took my phone. He said Caringbah, pretty similar to the way that I said it, and he got through straight away. I was like, oh! I was so frustrated. I ended up 50 minutes late eating cardboard pizza in the dark on the balcony, and my wife was by my side, so it was okay. There are many things in this world that seeks to disrupt and cause us anxiety and concern and worry, isn't there? That's just a pretty small thing. But what happens when it's something bigger? What happens when it's something more dark and disorientating and discouraging? How do we respond? What do we do in those moments as Christians? How do we deal with it? Back in 2022, we ended up getting a call from my mum back in Ireland, who was 61 at the time, telling us that she had terminal cancer. And she only had a number of months left to live. And so we packed up our whole family, ended up going back to Ireland. And I don't know if you've walked with anybody who has had a terminal cancer diagnosis, but one of the things that happens is normally a lot of the grief and a lot of the worry and the anxiety, it all comes early. It doesn't come just after they die. It's there, it's present. And I found myself back in Ireland, and all of this grief was just welling up inside me. And on top of that, the church that we had planted in Cronulla was going through some pretty tough times. It had throughout COVID financially. We were on leave without pay. We weren't sure where we would live while we were staying in Ireland. We didn't know how long it would go on for. And then on top of that, there was all of this trauma from growing up in a country that had civil war and growing up in a broken family that just seemed to mix together in this massive cocktail, and it just spilled out of me. I found myself on my bed bawling my eyes out for what seemed like hours. And it wasn't pretty crying either. I didn't look all that sweet. It was deep from the bones, deep from the inner recesses of my soul, snot, tears, everything. And I was inconsolable. There was only one thing that consoled me that night. It was that my wife, Catherine, fed me Indian curry and scratched my back at 3 a.m. in the morning. Now, that's not the answer, right? How do we deal with it? How do we kind of find consolation, or how do we find peace in those moments? It's not through curry and back scratches, as good as that is. Because when we're walking through the perils of this world, what we need is something far greater than that, isn't it? When we're walking through the perils of this world, what we need is a peace that is not of this world. So the question we're going to ask today is, how do we find peace in the perils of this world? Or even better, how do we experience the peace of God as we walk through the perils of this world? And that's really one of the things that Paul is trying to help the Philippians with here as they walk through many perils. They're not sure what's going to be happening with Paul. They've got division within the church. They've got persecution from outside of the church. And they're currently experiencing anxious thoughts and worry and concern. And Paul writes to them and he tells them to praise or to rejoice in the Lord always. Have a look at verse 4. Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Now, I'm not sure about you, but when I'm walking through deep, dark perils, the last thing I feel like I want to do is rejoice. And when I read that, it sounds like what Paul is saying is that he's saying for them just to conjure up happiness, to cheer up, to have a nice day. You live in the Gold Coast, you've got a job, you've got a house and a roof over your head. Just count your blessings, douse yourself in some essential oils, have a couple of ice baths, and just lay your head on your linen organic pillow, and she'll be right, mate. No worries. But Paul's not just being Australian here. This isn't what he's saying to the Philippians. Which, if you're walking through pain and perils and challenges, if your heart is anxious and filled with worry this morning, it's a real blessing that that's not what Paul's saying. It's a real blessing that that's not what Paul's saying. Because he's not saying that what you need to do is conjure up this thing in your own power and in your own strength. But he says, rejoice. Rejoice in the Lord always. Now, Paul knows what's going on for the Philippians. He knows how hard it is, and he knows what it is to walk through pain and perils himself. He knows what it is to have been persecuted. He's currently in prison. He knows what it is to have been perplexed and to be struck down. He knows what it is to have a thorn in his flesh. So he knows that just conjuring up this kind of full joy is something that just will not work. But then he's also experienced something else. He's also experienced what it is to have a peace that is not of this world as he walked through the perils of this world. He's not just a Zen master. He's not just someone who is telling them to do something that he hasn't done himself. No, he has experienced both the perils of this world and a peace that is not of this world. And he's not just telling them to rejoice or to just rejoice their heart. Did you see what he says there? They are to rejoice in the Lord. They're to rejoice in the Lord. Now, what does Paul mean by that, rejoicing in the Lord? Well, there are lots of different things that we could say about that, but if we just come back a verse, there's something that I reckon sparked this thought for Paul. Do you see it there at the end of verse 2? It's got something to do with our names being written in a thing called the Book of Life. And we actually get Jesus in Luke chapter 10 saying a similar thing to his disciples, where he basically tells them not to find joy and not to rejoice in the fact that their ministry is going well, but to rejoice in the fact that their names are written in the book of, or written in heaven. Two different ways, really, of just saying the same thing. Which, if that's new language for you today, basically all of it is a picture language that describes what happens when somebody puts their trust in Jesus. When someone becomes a Christian, it's a book that declares that you have said sorry to God for your rebellion against him, and you have put your trust in Jesus, and you have now went from being an enemy of God to a friend of God. And when that happens, your name is written in the book of life. It means that you're no longer a slave, but you are now freed people. But it also means that you are a child, that you have been adopted into God's family. Your name written in that book means that you are a child of God. And later on in the book of Revelation, that book comes up again in chapter 20, and one of the things that we see is that in the final judgment, that what happens is that book will be lifted and it will be opened up, and that Jesus will read the names, and for those who are in the book of life, that will mean that they will escape God's judgment and that they will enter into his presence and receive and experience his peace forever, because they are with the God of peace. It's a picture of security. It's a picture of assurance. It's a picture of the promised peace that we might receive in Jesus. And I think that Paul possibly reflects on this when he says in Romans 8, one of my favorite parts of the Bible, where he says that nothing, if your name's written in the book of life, nothing can separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus. You see, the problem with just conjuring up a joy that comes from ourselves is not just that it doesn't work. It's that even if we receive a smidgen of joy, which we do, that any joy that we find in the things of this world will just crumple away. But we rejoice in the fact that our names are written in the book of life, which means that that will never fade, it will never perish, and it will never fall away. We have security. We have hope. And that's why we rejoice. Is your heart feeling entangled by the busyness of this world this morning? Are you walking through deep perils and hardships and pain? If you are, and if you are in the Lord, your name is written in the book of life. Your name is written in the book of life. And that means that there will be a day where Jesus picks up that book and he reads out your name. Your name. And you will enter into his presence and you will experience his peace forever. What security that is. How we long for that kind of joy and rejoicing. It's not just rejoicing, it's rejoicing in the Lord. But it's not just about rejoicing in the consequences of our salvation or in the things that we receive from Jesus. It's actually about rejoicing in Jesus himself. Rejoicing in the person and the work of Jesus. And I know that that's something that you guys do well here at Liberti Church. It's part of your values, but I see it and I hear it as I talk to people this morning. It's actually about rejoicing in Jesus. It's not about waiting till eternity to experience the peace of God that is not of this world. We actually get to enjoy it and experience it now, here in the present, in and through the Holy Spirit. Joy in the one who gave up his life for us. Joy in the one who walks through the perils of this world with us because the Lord is near. Joy because we know that he is our ride or die. He is someone who will never leave us nor forsake us. Joy that even though we might walk through the valley of the shadow of death, that we know he will be with us. The Good Shepherd walking with us through into eternity. That's why Paul can rejoice whether he lives or he dies. And that's why Paul is calling the Philippians and calling us to rejoice in the Lord always. When my mum was dying of cancer, one of the joys that I had was actually getting to be with her. I never thought that I would get that. I thought I would just get a call one day and then we would have to fly back. But I got to spend lots of time with her. And one particularly special moment was on her 62nd birthday. I got to just spend some time talking to her by herself. She had become a Christian in our living room back in Australia 12 years prior to that, which brought me lots and lots of joy. But this is what she said. She had cancer riddled throughout her body, was having spontaneous fractures in her spine. We were struggling to keep on top of her pain relief. And this is what she said. I don't want to suffer more. But if I do, it will have been nothing compared to the suffering Jesus suffered for me. So if that's what I have in store, then I will follow him. If he uses my suffering and death to soften someone's heart or help them trust in Jesus, then it will have been worth it. When I was preparing this message, not only did I have a few tears in my eyes every time I think about that precious moment, but I realized that actually there was a word that I forgot because I was writing this down as she was speaking. And I think I forgot the word, maybe because I didn't quite believe it, or just because it slipped out just very, very naturally. Because actually what she said, and I don't know if my kids even know this who are here today, she actually said, I will gladly follow Jesus. I will gladly follow Jesus. She had joy in the Lord because she was in the Lord. And because she was in the Lord, even though everything was crumbling and breaking around her, she could confidently say and confidently rejoin her heart and say, I will gladly follow Jesus. I long for that kind of joy. I long to be able to say that I will gladly follow Jesus, even through the darkest perils of this world. And I can tell you, Liberty, that God did grant her an incredible peace, a peace that was not of this world. She rejoiced. We want that kind of joy, don't we? Yeah? You want that kind of joy. Well, Rejoicing in the Lord always is one of the ways that Paul actually says that we receive the peace of God. The only problem is there are lots of things, aren't there, that seek to steal that peace from us. That this side of heaven, it's often fleeting because there are so many perils and so many things that seek to steal that peace from us. Which is why Paul also tells the Philippians to present or to present their anxieties to God in prayer. Have a look at verse 6. Don't worry about anything, but in everything, through prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. Now, what does Paul mean here when he's talking about anxiety? Let me just say that he's not talking here about clinical anxiety, where you have an imbalance of chemicals in your brain. That's not what he's talking about here today. That's not what I'm talking about today. He's talking about being anxious, about having worry. And in the New Testament, there's effectively just one word that we get translated as worry, anxious, or concern. And it's used in two different ways. It's either used in a positive way or used in a negative way. So positively, in chapter 2, verse 20, Paul tells us that Epaphras has genuine concern for the Philippians. Or later in 2 Corinthians, Paul talks about having anxiety for all the churches. Actually, better translated, concern for all of the churches. It's a positive care and concern, a genuine care or a right level of care for the right things. Because they are things that we should have concern for, right? We should have concern that we don't have we should have concern that there is no disunity within the church, like we see with Euodia and Syntyche. We should have concern that our brothers and sisters in our church are growing up in the Lord into the head who is Jesus. We should have concern that our brothers and sisters persevere. We should have concern for the lost, that the 24 million people in Australia might come to know Jesus. We should have concern that we live such beautiful lives as we live out the gospel in our communities, that we present people with moments of peace, and more importantly, that we help them to see the Prince of Peace. There are many things that we ought to have the right care and the right concern for. But then there's also a negative way that this word's used, and we see it more clearly, I think, in Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 6 of Matthew. Turn in your Bibles there, Matthew 6, verse 25. Therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Now, I'm not sure about you, but they're pretty simple, normal things that I feel we should worry about. Yeah? Especially putting clothes on. That would definitely be a good thing to be worried about and be anxious about. And they're pretty normal things, aren't they? But the problem here is not having the right level of concern for the right things. Actually, Jesus is addressing an undue care or anxiety, an over-concern. Do you get it? The first one was positive. This way is more negative. It's an over-anxiety. And it's so easy, isn't it, for the basic, run-of-the-mill, everyday things to go from having a right level of concern to an undue level of concern. To go from rightly caring about something to having anxiety in our hearts, even over the most basic and simple things of life. Are you like that? I know I am. I know it's so easy. Now, how do we know that Jesus is addressing an over-concern here? Stay in Matthew 6 and come down to verse 28. Have a look for yourself. What is it that he says at the very end? You of little faith. You of little faith. How do we know that our right level of concern has turned to an undue concern? Well, Jesus tells us it's got something to do with faith. Appropriate concern turns to undue concern because we don't trust in God, Jesus says. Faith that God, our Father, knows what we need. Faith that he will provide. Faith that he cares. 2 Peter 5:7, cast your anxieties on him because he cares. Faith that your Father is in control of all things, that he is good, and not only that he is good, but that he wants and he is working for your ultimate good. Faith that he is a God who from the beginning of time has kept his promises and will continue to keep his promises into eternity. Jesus says you don't have to worry. Your Father in heaven knows. Seek first his kingdom and righteousness. Have the right level of care and concern for those things. And then he says, and all of these things will be added unto you as well. That's why we're to not be anxious. Now, how do we know that we've went from an appropriate level of concern to an undue level of concern or anxiety in our hearts? Well, it's when we trust ourselves to bring about peace in our perils rather than trusting God. Here's what Charles Spurgeon says, and I know Adam loves to quote Spurgeon. I think he wants a beard like Spurgeon as well. But this is what Spurgeon says. He says, undue care is an intrusion into God's province. It is making yourself the father of the household instead of being a child. It is making yourself the master instead of being a servant for whom the master provides his rations. It's when we put ourselves in the place of the Father and we try to bring about peace in our own power and in our own strength. It's when we try to think, numb, or forget our way out of our perils, all to solve them in our own peace and in our own strength and in our own power, which liberty might work for a while. But it's just a counterfeit peace at best. Because when we're walking through the perils of this world, we need a peace that is not of this world. We do it all the time, don't we? We just so easily slip into trying to be the father rather than being the child. But Paul tells us, or I think that what he's saying is that we get peace not by trying to be the father, but by being a child who presents all of our requests in everything to the Father. That's how we know if we've slipped from the right level of care and concern to undue care and concern. Don't worry about anything, Paul says, but in everything, through prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God, and the peace of God, listen to this promise, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Now, there's a couple of things before we wrap up this point that I want to just draw your attention to. We present everything in every situation to God. The good times, the hard times, the dark times, we present it all in every situation. We present all of the cares and concerns and worries of our hearts. And it actually doesn't matter if it's a positive, more in the positive sense or in the negative sense. We just present all of it to God because He's the Father and we're the child. We present all of it. But did you notice the way that we do it? We don't demand. We don't try to bend His arm and convince Him. We do it with thanksgiving. Thanksgiving for what? Well, it's thanksgiving for all that you have in the Lord. It's thanksgiving that the Lord is near, not just in the sense where his kingdom of peace is near, but actually the Lord himself is near. He is with you and walking with you side by side in and through the perils of this world. It's thanksgiving because you know that he will never leave you nor forsake you. It's thanksgiving because you know that he longs for your good. It's thanksgiving that he will give you peace. It's thanksgiving that he will galvanize your heart and your mind to be able to stand in the midst of the perils. But did you notice that the promise of peace here is not a promise of peace because he is promising to lift us out of our perils and our situation? Did you notice that? It's not that he promises if we present all of our worries to God in prayer with thanksgiving that he will then stop all of the things that are causing us to be anxious and concerned. Now, he might do that, and thank God that he does that. But that's not the promise. The promise is not pray and then all of your worries will go away. The promise is present these things to God with thanksgiving, and you will get what? You will get a peace that is not of this world. That's the promise. It's thanksgiving that no matter how God might answer your prayers in your perils, that you know that he is good, that you know he is in control, and that you know that he cares. When I was on my bed bawling my eyes out, it wasn't Indian curry and back scratches that brought me peace that night. It certainly kind of stopped me from bawling my eyes out, which was helpful. But it was that I had a beautiful moment where I felt God actually speaking to me in that moment. And I know that if you've walked through dark times, this may not have happened for you. It was a grace that God gave me in that moment. And he really just came alongside me like I was struggling to pray. And he came alongside me and he just said, Lee, I've got you. I've got you. I've got your mom. I've got your family. I've got your church back in Australia. I've got you. Give me all of these worries. Trust me. And if you're walking through perils here this morning, that's what you need to hear, isn't it? The Lord is near. He is in control. He cares. I've got you. I've got you. Trust me. I've got you. Now, these things that Paul is urging the Philippians to do, they don't come easy. He knows it's hard. He knows that in those moments it's hard for us to do what he's asking, which is why he also tells the Philippians to practice the things that they have been taught, or to do. Have a look at verse 9. Do, or in other translations it will say practice, what you have learned and seen, or learned and received and heard from me and seen in me, and the God of peace will be with you. Practice what you have learned. A good mate of mine back at home, he's in the army, and he's currently been doing lots of exercises, and they've been going away to basically practice what they have learned. They're not particularly learning any new skill, but they're actually going over the same things over and over and over again, because there's a possibility that they might need to enter the Russian-Ukraine war. And he tells me that they practice in times of peace to prepare for times of war. And actually, as Christians, it's the same. We need to practice in times of peace to prepare ourselves for times of peril. Perils and hardships that we know will come our way because we live in a broken, fallen world. Perils and hardships that we know will come our way because we are followers of Jesus. We prepare in peace for the perils of this world. So how do we do that? There is so much here that we could say. It's by practicing rejoicing in every situation. It's by presenting all of our requests to God. It's by doing that daily, by practicing that. But let me just pick up on one thing a moment. We practice the things that we have learned by thinking. Not thinking in the way that we think. Actually, the CSB has got this better. Just look at the verse before. It's about dwelling. Dwelling. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, or whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any moral excellence and if anything praiseworthy, dwell on these things. Now, these things are pointing to many more things than what I'm going to say today, but when I read the words true, honorable, just, pure, lovely, commendable, moral excellence, do you know what I think of? Jesus. Jesus. We are to dwell on the person and the work of Jesus and what that means for our hearts and for our lives. This is not just about thinking. It's not just about having the right information, but it's rather dwelling and having the right information that causes transformation in our hearts. It's about dwelling on the truths of the gospel and the promises of Jesus. It's about telling our hearts that we have been saved and sanctified, that we have been adopted, that we have been written into the book of life, that we are children of God, that he who began a good work in you will see it through to completion, will see it through to completion. And we could go on and on and on and on with the promises of God, couldn't we? Liberty, this is what you have learned. You know the gospel. You know Jesus. You experience it. You hear the gospel being preached week in and week out. Keep practicing. Keep practicing. Keep dwelling. Keep remembering those things. Keep speaking the truth of the gospel into one another's hearts. Keep singing the praises of Jesus so that the Holy Spirit might take those truths and massage them deep into the deep, dark crevices of your heart that is yet to believe. The first time I heard the song that you sung earlier, just really struck me, where you have a line, Jesus is better, help me to believe. That's practicing. That's allowing the Spirit of God to push the truths of God into your heart so that you might believe. Keep practicing. But don't just practice so that you might receive peace in the perils of this world. That is awesome, but it's not just a formula to receive peace. No. We dwell on these things because we want to sit at the feet of the Prince of Peace, don't we? We dwell on Jesus himself, just like Mary and Martha. Martha was running around busy in the house when Jesus came over for dinner, and Mary sits at Jesus' feet. We dwell with Jesus, the Prince of Peace. Not just on the things that we receive from him. And as we do that, as we practice in times of peace for times of peril, God will galvanize our hearts. The gospel will flow out in ways that we would never imagine. We will receive a peace that is not of this world. You know, my mom was able to say, and I didn't really see this fully until afterwards, but she was able to say that she would gladly follow Jesus, not because she just was some happy-go-lucky kind of person and positive all the time. She was Irish, not Australian, so she's kind of pretty negative, right, on lots of things. It wasn't because she just conjured up something in the moment. It's because she cultivated her relationship with Jesus. Now, sometimes, and I think I'm actually being just a little bit soft on this, but sometimes the reason we don't feel and experience the peace of God It's actually because we're not practicing dwelling with God. Sometimes the reason why we don't experience peace in peril-some situations is because we're so entangled with our sin that we don't present things to the Lord. Sometimes we don't experience the peace of God because, like Syntyche and Euodia, there's division and arguments and quarreling within our church. You know, this is not just actually spoken to individuals, it's actually spoken to the whole church. So what do we do with that? We rejoice in the Lord always. We present our requests to the Lord. We dwell in Him. And as we have that peace that God promises, then our gentleness will be made known to all. Then we will not just be individuals who experience the peace of God, but we'll be a community and a family who experiences the peace of God, and we mediate that to each other in our gentleness. Could it be that the reason why this morning that you're not experiencing and feeling peace in your heart, could it be that you're not dwelling with the Lord? Could it be that there's some sin that's entangling you? Could it be that you're in conflict with people in your community? Could it be? Mum had only been a Christian for 12 years, but I got to have her Bible and read through it with her, and actually when she died. And one of the things that I saw was that she clearly dwelled on the Lord daily. She had rhythms of just spending time with the Lord. Anytime I went over, she was always reading her Bible. The kids will tell you that. But actually, when I looked in her Bible, it was just filled with notes, underlines, triple underlines, not because she was trying to get information, but she just wanted to dwell with Jesus. She practiced what she had received and learned. And that meant that she regularly presented her requests to God. And that meant that she experienced an extraordinary peace in a significant time of peril. Liberty, I don't know about you, but I want that kind of peace. Don't you? I want that peace not just when I'm walking through perils, but I want that peace when I'm just trying to drive to church. I want that peace when I'm just trying to work out the everyday things that bring us worry and anxiety in our hearts. So how do we experience the peace of God? How do we do that? Well, we praise. We rejoice. We rejoice in the Lord always, because there are so many things for us to rejoice in. That doesn't mean that we ignore what's going on in our life. But as we fix our eyes on Jesus, we will see those things in their right perspective. As we fix our eyes on Him and as we rejoy our hearts, we will be more peaceful. And in those moments where you struggle to do that, we are a people who present all of our anxieties and all of our requests to the Lord in prayer, in thanksgiving, and whatever way it is that He might answer our prayers, that we trust Him. He is good. He longs for your good. So we present all of our requests to Him, and we practice. We practice. We keep dwelling on the truth. We keep gathering together in GCs in midweek and in our church and singing the praises. We practice speaking or gospeling one another. We practice. We dwell. And God promises that when we do that, that we will experience the peace of God, and that the God of peace will be with you, Liberti Church.